Alrighty, so today we have one networking issue, one obsolescence, and then one spec review. Who wants to give us the honors here? Jeffrey, do you want to do it?
Yes, I'd be happy to do it. So as some of you probably remember, we not too long ago decided to remove the system.net.connection stuff from 5.0. We have heard from a couple customers since then that they really wanted the ability to hook the way that Socket's HTTP handler creates connections, which was one of the big things, the biggest thing that the system.net.connection stuff, Connection Factory, gave them. So this is a proposal for how to do effectively the same thing using just a delegate callback instead of the Connection Factory base class. The proposed API is pretty straightforward. It's virtually the same as what the Connection Factory used to provide, except with a couple of exceptions. One is it returns just a plain stream instead of a connection object. Another is that instead of a property bag, so the old API took DNS endpoint, property bag, cancellation token, if I remember correctly. And the request message was passed as part of the property bag. Now we just pass the HTTP request message directly. That was the only thing that was actually passed directly from Socket's HTTP handler in the past anyway. So the key point here is it's just a simple API. It's just a simple callback. If you don't hook it, you get default behavior. If you do hook it, it's up to you. You can do pretty much anything you want as far as returning a stream and Socket's HTTP handler will use it. I think the one question that we should discuss is just the naming. Do we like connect callback? I don't know if we have general guidance on how to name these sort of like, it's not really, I don't know if callback is the best term. It's really just a hook. But anyway, that's the API. What do you think?
Just thinking forward, since this was inspired by the net connections, is the name or anything about this going to interfere with the net connections proposal?
No, I think with net connections in the future, we will. Well, first of all, we won't allow you to set both this and a connection factory because they, do the same thing. But the old property was called connection factory, so I don't think there's any problem with having the two aside from some duplicativeness in the API, but we can live with that.
How confident are you that you never need another parameter?
I mean, I think net connections in the next release will give it the extension it needs, and this one effectively is already deprecated, right?
Yeah. I would keep in mind that although we'll definitely be considering it, it's not 100% that net connections will get into 6.0.
Yeah, and another point is that the connection callback is much simpler to use. So I expect that we had like 5, 6, 7, 8 issues on GitHub that actually needed basically just the connection callback. Instead of going into the full-blown abstractions of the connection factory, they will probably prefer to go through simplicity. That's my expectation, even going forward.
As far as new parameters, HTTP request message does have its own property bag on it, so that gives us at least some escape here in the sense that if there's information that people want to flow through, they can set it on their HTTP request messages, and they'll be able to see it in the connection callback. Now they won't see it on not every request causes a new connection to be created, and they can't predict very easily which ones will, but still it allows them at least some mechanism for sort of passing information through.
Is there a model that they can decide they didn't want to hook it after looking at the thing? Like return null means that it'll do what it was going to do anyway?
Currently, no. We could add something like that, but it's the amount of code necessary to just do the socket connect is not that great. It's
So one thing we did in the initial APIs was we exposed like a static method on sockets handler. It was like the default connect method, so that users could override behavior or just call the default, or maybe they just want to change DNS around or something and call the default connect method there. I realize that's more work. Maybe we don't have time or confidence enough to do that, but usability would be improved there.
Yeah, I like that suggestion. Given the point we're at in 5.0, I think I would probably say it's not strictly needed, and so let's punt it. But it's if we had more time, I agree, we'd probably want to do something like that.
I'm fine with that. I mean, we can just provide an example with the same default for people to copy paste into their apps.
Isn't that broken if you can't call the base logic? Do you have to expose the default callback or pass in a callback? Like to do like at a bare minimum, you would need to pass in the previous like caller, right? So I could actually do stuff and then call base and basically call base.
Well,
and tweak settings.
As Corey was saying, I think if we wanted to provide the call base capability, we'd provide it as some sort of static function that you could just call yourself from within here.
Yeah. So we would do that, right? Or no?
I think it would be good to, like I said, I think it'd be good to have that. I don't think it's mandatory for 5.0.
Okay.
I mean, the static one doesn't give you chaining though, right? Because it basically just means that if you only have one default, you can expose a static. But if you have like, party A hooks the event, party B hooks the event, party C hooks the event, if you actually pass in the previous one, then, they all get chained nicely.
Yeah. Yeah. There's no chaining ability here. It's just simply you've got one hook and you can plug in whatever you want.
Right. Well, that's why I think some of the APIs in ASP.NET give you effectively the previous handler as an argument, and then you basically call that one. And then if you have multiple ones, it's still chained, right? And each handler basically decides when to call it.
Yeah.
Is this meant to be a public field rather than a property or event?
No, it's meant to be a property.
Okay.
Sorry.
So a property as opposed to an event. So it's get set rather than add remove.
Yeah, I think an event doesn't make sense because you're connecting here, so I don't know what a multicast delegate could do.
Sure.
Well,
and you could always chain it yourself if you had to.
Yeah. All delegates are multicast in C# today.
Yeah, but an event makes it seem like we support that.
Yeah. Yeah, an event has kind of like built-in support for multicasting, whereas a regular property is just like we expect a single setter. Along those lines, is it typical that we would use func with 4 different generic variables here rather than just defining a custom delegate type?
Yeah, that was what I was kind of hinting at earlier. Like my concern here is if we ever add another one, even if we then pass it into the property bag, it becomes somewhat of a problem because it's not very discoverable at that point. And yes, you can expose technically another callback, like connect to callback or whatever, which effectively does the property bag lookup and stuff for customers, but then it becomes just very ugly in the API, right?
Well, even if it was a custom delegate, we can't add a new parameter.
Right.
No, not a custom delegate, but you could have a context, struct that basically where you have func of connect context and then comma value task of stream, right?
If it was a custom delegate, you could also have cancellation token be optional.
That is also the problem with using funcs, yeah.
Yeah. I mean,
it's going to be called from an internal code, so I guess users could call it too, but I don't know if an optional parameter gets us much here anyway.
Yeah, that's fair, yeah, because you called it.
Yeah, I mean, the written guidance is if func or action can be used, they should be used unless looking at it, you realize you need names on parameters to make it make sense. That's the guidance we wrote.
Is there concerns with users getting and invoking the callback themselves?
Don't do that.
So they're they're the ones setting the callback.
Yeah,
the
but
default is null.
if it's a property, they can get the callback, and then they can either chain or they can get it, or they can invoke it themselves. And I'm not sure if that's a concern that they're able to do that.
I mean, don't you have that today with things like the certificate validation callback? Isn't it just a get set property?
Yeah.
I mean, if it's a property, like, sure, it's gettable. Don't abuse it, I guess, if you have access to it.
It is locked on first use. In other words, once you start using the HTTP client, we prevent you from modifying this further, which is the same as all the properties on Saga's HTTP handler or any handler.
Yeah, I mean, if you are able to trigger the callback here, I mean, nothing bad will happen. You just get a stream that the user then drops on the floor, right? You don't really mess with the state of the handler. It's really more when you actually set, or once the thing is, once your request is pending, and then you set it, then bad things might happen, right? Yeah, so I think I'm generally fine with using regular properties for callbacks. I mean, that's a pattern that we have used elsewhere, because events come with a lot of other baggage, right? It's not just the add or remove, it's also the naming convention, the event handler of T signature, and that seems not super useful here. My only concern really is with the parameters, because every time we say, oh, we only ever need 4 parameters, it tends to not hold very well over time.
So what would the solution be to that? I mean,
So
if we created a connect context that was would it be a struct or a class, and we could put the DNS endpoint and the HTTP request message on it, and then in the future we've got an opportunity to put more stuff on that struct? Is that the right way to think about it?
And then basically people who handle the connect handler, they can just now dot into more stuff onto the context, right? But nothing changes.
That's fine by me. I mean, I don't think that as long as it's a struct, there's no additional allocation there. Not that it really matters. We're only doing this once per connection.
Right.
Yeah, I think that'd be fine. I mean, there were some other things we identified, like maybe a user would want to see what host name they were connecting to, if it was a proxy versus non-proxy, things like that. And we might put that in that context in the future.
That is true.
And the callback is specific to sockets handler, right? So
Yes.
what would we call the context then?
Connection context.
Sockets HTTP connection context.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I mean, I'm not super keen on that name either, but like I would have some prefix with sockets so it doesn't appear elsewhere.
Right, but sockets connect context sounds more like it belongs with sockets instead of sockets HTTP handler.
Yeah, we need the full mouthful.
Sockets HTTP connection context seems reasonable.
Is it gonna be nested struct in the class or outside?
I would say outside.
Someone would type it in their own code, so outside.
It should be a class, not struct.
Did I just hear that correctly, Fowler?
It's gonna get bigger. It's gonna get bigger and bigger. So it's gonna probably reference some point.
I guess it depends on if we want to support this. Like, say systemnet connections ends up happening for 6.0.
Yeah, it will.
I assume we'd just, maybe not obsolete, but at least stop updating this API.
That we would leave it basically for the basic simple case, and advanced stuff would be into the connection factory, right?
Yep.
Yeah. Although Tobe might disagree with that, so channeling him, we should prepare for the worst.
Yeah. You think that the connection context, the passing a context is better than passing individual arguments? We should do that now, regardless of what we think we're going to do in 6.0.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think an allocation for a class is totally fine. I mean, systemnet connections was going to allocate a lot more than this anyway, so.
Does it
If
need
it's-
to? Go ahead.
I was going to say if it's a class, then the visibility of mutations on cancellation token and value task change because they're now passed by reference.
I don't think we pass cancellation token or well, the value task is the return parameter.
Oh,
So
right.
I'm guessing it's just DNS endpoint and HTTP request message that we would pass on. And why does it have to be a class and not a struct? Is there a compat issue?
I think the worry is that in the past, when we've tried passing a struct, we often end up making it into a class behind the scenes and just have the struct forward to the class. So this kind of avoids some messiness there.
A struct is fine. Like if you're wrapping a single reference type, if it gets bigger and bigger, then it becomes more costly to copy a struct anyway.
Yeah.
Well, you could just pass it by ref from the get-go.
Yeah, but that's gross, right? The syntax is kind of gross for passing by ref for this.
It's an async method also, so passing by ref would not be great.
Yeah. Okay.
Oh yeah, the async is a good point.
One thing that we might consider, we've had some requests for supporting like non-HTTP endpoints. I haven't seen convincing argument that we should do that, but DNS endpoint would kind of lock us into the current decision rather than opening us up to, Unix domain socket endpoint or something.
Oh, so you mean non-TCP as opposed to non-HTTP? I'm like, I don't know what it would mean for sockets HTTP handler to do Gopher. Like,
yeah, I mean the current thought is it's an HTTP client. It's totally valid for us to grab the host name from the URL and say this is a DNS endpoint. You do your thing with it. But users end up kind of having to work around it. Like if they need to open up a Unix domain socket, they have to somehow take their Unix path and put it inside the host name or pass it in through the property bag. And it gets kind of messy. So we've had some talk of, maybe create a new API that doesn't use URIs or allows you to communicate the endpoint in some other way.
Fair enough. I mean, if you move to the connection context thing now, then it's just the DNS endpoint property would be null and the other endpoint would not be null.
Yeah, that's a good point.
So, which is interesting. How do we generally feel about, because we haven't had nullability for a long time, how do we feel about something not being nullable in 5 and then being nullable in 6?
It would break implementers, wouldn't it?
Yeah, it would, because they'd be expecting it to never be null. I mean, the only reason that they would get a null is if they caused that by using some other new API as well. So I suppose we have a little leeway there.
Well, but anybody who wasn't using the new API would now see the question mark in the reference assembly. And
true, they'll get a bunch of warnings.
Plus, if they compiled against 5 but ran on 6, and then they hit the Unix domain socket scenario, then null appears even though the ref assembly said it shouldn't. So, yeah, if you think you're going to possibly replace it in the future, may as well make it nullable now.
Sorry, which parameter were you talking about?
DNS endpoint.
I have trouble imagining a world where an HTTP request doesn't have at least some trivial